Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Scotland, episode 26, 11th Century Warfare. So I am back from my first holiday, in Rome of all places. It was an amazing place to visit. So much history was learnt from the period of the Romans to the rise of the Catholic Church. A lot of stuff I'm going to be telling throughout our podcast for sure. If you haven't been to Rome yet, please do. It is to me such an overwhelming place in terms of splendour and history, and you can really see it's rivaled next to no places in the world. I kind of consider it the ancient capital of the world, even though I guess you could argue about Athens, etc. But I really think Rome has so much history to show. So any history nuts out there, please get yourself a cheap flight to Rome, spend a few days exploring the Colosseum, the Forms, just everything around Rome itself. But sadly, this does mean I'm going on my second holiday this week. This does mean this is the last episode you are getting this month. I'm sorry for this, but along with the episode 1 rewrite I am doing, I certainly don't have the time to release another episode this month. But don't worry, we'll return back to 3 episodes next month, starting around the week beginning of the 5th of September. As I said last episode, my goal is to get round to the Bruce family by next year. So that is my goal. Will I achieve it? Who knows? Last time, we closed the book of Scotland's 2 shortest lived kings, Donald III and Duncan II. I was rather disappointed in Duncan II particularly, as he did not amount to much. He was really an interesting character. He was held hostage in England, he became a Norman knight serving with Robert Curthose, and finally fought and won the throne back for himself in Scotland. I feel like you could write a book on his story and his exploits, but to be honest, no one ever did. Sadly, something we will learn throughout Scottish history is a disdain for anything other than Scottish in the court of Scotland as well. That was Duncan's downfall, but he wouldn't be the last to experience this, and someone I keep bringing up, David I, would also have to fight throughout his reign, but it has to be said he was a lot more successful than Duncan, considering he lasted a lot more than 6 months. Anyway, we will start the reign of Edgar, the next king of Scotland, next month. I know. I said we were going to start his reign today, but I decided I wanted to do a slightly different episode to close out this month and centre it in a current history timeline. Please don't hate me, but I always wanted to provide a wider telling and understanding at this time in history. So, Edgar we will do next time. Again, apologies for that. Today, I want us to take a step back and give a slight update on how warfare is fought in the 11th and 12th century. Last time round, we discussed how this was in the early days of the Kingdom of Alba, where war bands and raiding parties formed the main baseline for an army, how armour and weapons varied from person to person, and how the quality of said gear was dependent on your class in society. So, how has this changed over the years? Well, let's find out as we take a look at the type of warfare in the years of King Malcolm of Scotland and King Edgar of Scotland. In the period between the 1000s and 1100s, warfare was one of the defining features of society in Western Europe. The prevalence of martial conflict was a fact of which observers at the time were aware. From around the 1000s, contemporaries began to formulate a view of society, which divided its members into 3 groups, according to the functions that they performed in society. These 3 groups, or orders as they were known as, consisted of those who worked, those who prayed, and those who fought. It was the last of these 3, the warriors, who attracted much attention from contemporary chroniclers and historians. To understand how Western Europeans conducted warfare in the Central Middle Ages, it is important to have a sense of some of the key features of politics and culture in this period. The most essential fact to bear in mind is that key to Western European society in the Central Middle Ages was land, or more specifically, the ownership of land. As a result, the interests of landowners often shaped warfare. Military activity was invariably conducted by the ruling elite in order to protect their own land, or with the aim to capture new territory from a rival. While there was a degree of development in the technology of weapons and armour over the period compared to where we were at the start of the Kingdom of Alba, there was no great transformative revolution throughout these centuries. Warfare remained largely dictated by the length of the archer could shoot an arrow, or by the strength of the arms that wielded swords and spears. The period of the 1000s to 1100s is worth considering in its own right, Separately from the era that went before and that which came after, the beginning of the Central Middle Ages witnessed a significant change in the course of Western European history, and the overall character of the wars and its inhabitants generally fought. In the centuries down to about 1100, Western Europeans fought significant defensive wars against Vikings from Scandinavia, against the Magyars from Eastern Europe, the area that is now Hungary, and against Muslim forces which exerted pressure northwards from the Mediterranean. Around 1100, the danger of external attacks diminished, and Western Europeans went on the offensive. In the centuries that followed, bands of arm-bearers such as Normans, famous then as now for their aggressive character and lust for adventure, captured a range of territories in different parts of Europe and beyond. And again, we've gone through all of the Normans' history in their own episode, A History of the Normans. So please go listen to that if you wish to learn more. Most famously, though, as we know, the Normans captured England in 1066 before their successors turned their attention to the surrounding lands of Wales, Ireland, and our Kingdom of Scotland, as William Rufus and his descendants fought Malcolm and Margaret's descendants in the years and decades that followed. Major conquests by the states from Germany conquered the territories east of the river Alba, the territories that is known as Poland and the lands surrounding the Baltic Sea. Many arms-bearers flocked to Iberia to take part in the wars aimed at taking the peninsula from the Muslim powers who had conquered it in the 8th century. This became known as Reconquista. In the Central Middle Ages, Western European arms-bearers also waged war under the banner of the cross in expeditions known as crusades. These campaigns called for and supported by the church and targeted against groups held up in the enemies of Christendom. They were conducted various theatres within Europe as well as to northern Africa and perhaps most significantly the Near East, the location of the holy city of Jerusalem. A number of factors which shaped Western European history after the 1300s, including the profound economic changes, the repercussions of the Black Death, and perhaps most significantly the invention of gunpowder, meant that from the 14th century warfare began to take on a distinct and new character. The physical remains of warfare fought during the Middle Ages are still evident today, perhaps most obviously in the form of mighty castles. Many of these structures still dominate the landscape of various regions of Western Europe, standing as monuments to the centrality of warfare in the medieval age. In some regions, such as Wales, which may be the middle of the 13th century, was perhaps the most heavily militarised region of Europe. This built evidence in the more apparent than elsewhere, yet it is easy to overlook the fact that the consequences of medieval warfare on the course of European history and development can be seen today in other ways. To a significant degree, military activity over the Middle Ages played a significant role in shaping cultural, linguistic, and political boundaries of modern Europe. France represents a good example which can illustrate this point. At the start of our period, the authority of the Kingdom of France extended not much further than Paris and its immediate surroundings. By the end of this period, the French monarchy had, through conquest, political manoeuvring and alliances, extended its interests far beyond that to attain, at least theoretically, authority over a space that looks not unlike the country we can see on the maps today. While we should be wary of accepting simple models of continuity, it is not misleading to suggest the foundations of modern France were laid by the wars of the French kings during the Middle Ages. In the period between the 1000s and 1100s, armies were raised by several means. Chiefly, troops were recruited as one of the system of landholding that dominated much of Europe. A lord, and this included the kings, such as our King Malcolm, would dole out parcels of land to his followers, in the expectation they would provide military service when called upon to do so. Mercenaries, men who fought in return for pay rather than through any obligation owed to their commander, became more prominent over the course of the period as well. But that was more towards the 12th and 13th centuries. One central problem that confronts modern historians of medieval warfare is that contemporary chroniclers generally provide unreliable figures for the numbers of troops who take part in any given action. It is not uncommon for chroniclers to assert that armies consisted of forces that numbered in the millions, far beyond the realms of what rulers could realistically put into the field. The best solution for dealing with this is often to accept these figures as conveying an order of magnitude. Hence, an army of 6 million might be interpreted as saying meaning a very large army indeed. The troops raised by commanders in this period consisted of infantry, missilemen, archers and crossbow, and the mounted armoured warriors known to history as knights. The image of the knight has in many ways come symbolically to represent the Middle Ages as a whole. They are as familiar to us as they were to medieval observers, depicted as they are in the Bayeux Tapestry and in the carved statues installed on the Chartres Cathedral and other churches around Europe in this period. In 1100, a knight was simply a warrior who fought on horseback, who had no particular standing, but over the course of the 12th century, knights gradually came to acquire an enhanced social status. By the end of the 13th century, the knighthood and nobility of Western Europe had essentially fused. After this point, to be a knight, one needed to be a noble, and vice versa. A principal catalyst for the fusion of nobility and the knighthood was the emergence of the warrior ethos, known as chivalry. Chivalry was consistently changing and evolving. It meant different things to different people at different times. Most significantly, chivalry has been understood in different ways by successive generations since 1300, and we must be wary of imposing later understandings of chivalry back onto the 12th and 13th centuries and to the 10th and 11th centuries. In brief, around the 1200s, chivalry consisted of a set of principles which set out the ideal conduct of a knight on the battlefield, and how the knight was expected to treat those enemies whom he had defeated. Some of the most famous works to survive from the Middle Ages, such as Chanson de Ronald, the Song of Ronald, whose earliest form dates to about the 1100s, are devoted to exploring the issues that could arise as knights sought to uphold the ideals of chivalry. Major pitched battles, like the fort near Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, dominate perceptions of the period. Yet in fact, major battles were expectation rather than the norm in this period. In other words, they rarely happened or didn't want to happen. Warfare was an expensive endeavour, and many lords did not wish to gamble everything on one encounter, whose encounter was often difficult, if not impossible, fully to control. This is not, however, to suggest that substantial military activity did not take place in the Central Middle Ages. It certainly did. That activity, though, more often than not took place on the level of raids and skirmishes, or sieges, as we know with what happened with King Malcolm's death in the last episode. Commanders would generally target an enemy's lands, terrorising or capturing the people who lived on it and destroying crops, livestock and buildings, again, like Malcolm's invasion of Northumbria and how he was raiding the Northumbrian territory. Yet, even if battle itself was rare, the prospect of fighting a major battle remained a decisive feature in how warfare was conducted. This was because every commander had to at least contemplate giving battle if the situation demanded it. If they did not, then all the other military activity was bluff. Moreover, it is a case that in some instances commanders did actively seek battle, no doubt because battles offered the prospect of a quick and decisive outcome, which raids and sieges did not. William the Conqueror certainly sought battle in 1066 and provoked King Harold into taking the bait and committing to a major set-piece encounter. Behind this is another important point. For a battle to take place in this era, most of the time both sides needed to be willing to fight. A commander who did not wish to give battle could generally avoid doing so, until it was necessary or desirable. Much attention, both medieval and modern, has centred upon the role of the mounted warrior, the knight, in battle. A number of contemporary sources draw attention to the impact that a group of knights charging in line in unison with their lances fixed ahead could have on the enemy lines, just like we mentioned about the Normans charging with their knights and how that gave a sense of dread and a sense of fear to the opposing enemy. Descriptions of this manoeuvre, known by the French word chevaucher, dominate many accounts of battles fought in this era, but we should be wary of taking those sources at face value. Many chroniclers wrote with an audience of knightly nobles in mind, and so we can perhaps expect them to place a particular emphasis on the importance of knights in battle, rather than on, say, the more mundane actions carried out by the infantry or archers. And if you think about it, there's certainly going to be more infantrymen and archers than there are knights. Look at the late English army, which had certainly more archers than men-at-arms, and look at the Scottish warriors themselves. They were more on foot than they were on horseback. Throughout history, armies have constructed fortified places as a normal part of warfare, and this was certainly the case in the Middle Ages. The ruling elite who owned land generally travelled around their various estates in order to consume the foodstuffs produced by each parcel of land belonging to them. In order to do this, they needed to comfortably be safe in accommodation, which could withstand a reasonable level of enemy attack as well. They needed, in other words, castles. At their most essential function, castles were the residences of the ruling elite. They also acted as sentries for administration and rulership. In other words, castles were one of the instruments of power wielded by the ruling elite. While castles were often primarily defensive, look at Newcastle and how King Malcolm avoided that on his invasion, oftentimes they acted simply as a refuge into which a commander could lead his troops to evade raids conducted by an enemy. They also could serve to menace and threaten opponents, and it certainly threatened Malcolm in his invasion, and that is why he avoided Newcastle entirely. At the very outset of our period, many castles in Western Europe were wooden structures. One might think here in terms of the Motte and Bailey structure. But the 11th and especially the 12th centuries witnessed a significant upsurge in the construction of new fortifications made out of stone. From the early 11th century, contemporaries report the spread of fortifications, and some historians have linked this to wider political processes, which served to diminish the central power of kings. The earlier stone structures were simple. They often were little more than box-shaped towers known as donjons. Examples of this type of building are provided with the White Tower, the kernel of the Tower of London, on which construction began in the reign of William the Conqueror, and fortifications at Colchester in Essex and at Rouen in Normandy. Over time, the designs of stone castles became more and more complex. We see the emergence of what historians call concrete castles. In simple terms, these castles were built like Russian dolls. They had two lines of walls, with the inner wall being defensive against the outer line if it ever fell to the enemy. Richard I of England was immensely proud of his Chateau Gilliard, which might translate from the French into English as Saucy Castle, a concrete castle he had built at the end of the 12th century on the border between his Duchy of Normandy and the lands of the Kingdom of France. In some respects, the zenith of castle building can be seen in the structures erected in Wales at the behest of Edward I after the conquest of 1282, but we'll leave our Hammer of the Scots to a later time, shall we? These developments in castle building were accompanied by linked developments in the art of siege warfare. There was something of an arms race as siegecraft evolved to keep up with the ever more impervious castles being constructed around Europe. Sieges far outnumbered all types of warfare in this period, including pitched battles. Again, commanders would prefer to besiege an enemy than risk a full-fledged battle where they could die. A siege was safe, they could pull back, they could retreat. And I know some of you are probably going to type right now and say Malcolm wasn't safe at his siege, but that's because Malcolm didn't expect to be flanked from behind by the opposing enemy and be surrounded. So that's kind of Malcolm's fault rather than the norm. They can be boiled down to a very simple dynamic as well. For besieging armies, the aim was to starve the enemy of all the resources they had stored in their castle. On the other hand, the aim of the forces contained within a besieged castle was to hold out, either until the besieging army used all of its resources up, or a friendly army came to attack the enemy forces set around the castle. The best constructed and supplied castles could hold out for many months against a besieging force. A number of different siege engines could be employed as well, including throwing machines such as mongrels, catapults and trebuchets in the later years, as well as devices intended to provide shelter to attacking troops as they closed on the city walls. During the siege of Jerusalem in July 1099, which we'll be going over in its own episode as I said, the armies of the First Crusade constructed siege towers, 3-story highs, which placed on wheels so that they could be rolled up to the city walls and protect the warriors stationed within. What happened to the inhabitants of these castles and towns though? If you did not surrender and you wished to withhold, you had two choices. You could give the enemy commander a date to which you would surrender the castle and town, and that would be around the time where you would expect a friendly army to come save you, and if the friendly army did not come save you, you would surrender the town. If that happened, normally the army within and the inhabitants within would not be treated unfairly. They would be allowed to leave, without their arms of course, but they'd still be allowed to leave with their life intact. However, if you refused to give up the castle and town, and you did not give any date, and you withheld and withheld and withheld, the enemy army would sack you, and this is where the rape, the plundering, the burning of castle and towns would take place. Think Viking style, but 10 times worse. If we look back at Scotland in this period as well, the later decrees indicated the common army was a levy of all able-bodied freemen aged between 16 and 60. I know, that seems like a long time to be fighting. With an 8 days warning, they would be called up. It produced relatively large numbers of men serving for a limited period, usually as unarmoured or poorly armoured bowmen and spearmen. In this period, it continued to be mustered by the earls, and they often led their men into battle, as was the case in the Battle of Standard in 1138. It would continue to provide the vast majority of Scottish national armies, potentially providing tens of thousands of men for short periods of conflict into the early modern era. They also developed obligations that produced smaller numbers of feudal troops. The introduction of feudalism to Scotland is usually attributed to the Davidian revolution of the 12th century, but as I said last time, we'll get to David's reforms in due time. In the Highlands and the Islands, the longship was gradually succeeded by, in ascending order of size, the Berlin, Highland Galley and Limpad, which were singular-built ships, usually with a centrally staped mast, but also with oars that allowed them to be rowed. Like the longship, they had a high stern, and the stern were still small and light enough to be dragged across the portages, but they replaced the steering board with a stern rudder from the late 12th century. They could fight at sea and were able to be moved across lands. This was often used by the Norwegians in Scotland, but also by Scottish lords as well. However, they could usually outrun larger vessels and were extremely useful in quick raids and in aid in escaping. Forces of ships were raised throughout obligations of a ship levy through the system of outlands lands and penny lands, which have been argued to date back to the muster system of the Kingdom of Del Rita, but probably were introduced by the Scandinavian settlers. Later evidence suggests the supply of ships for war became linked to feudal obligations with Celtic Scandinavian lords who had previously contributed as a result of a general levy on landholding, coming to hold their lands in exchange for specific numbers and sizes of ships supplied to the king. This process probably began in the 13th century, but would intensify under Robert I. The importance of these ships were underlined by the becoming common in depictions of grave markings and in the heraldry throughout the Highlands and Islands. There are mentions in the medieval records of fleets commanded by Scottish kings, including William the Lion and Alexander II. We will get into the naval battles that these two performed when we get to their reign after Edgar's. So, we will leave the update on warfare there for now. We'll probably do another one of these around the time of the famous Scottish Independence Wars, so around the 13th to 14th century, to give you more of an update and a grander scale of things around Europe as well. So I think we might split that into 3 episodes where we'll do one on warfare, maybe one on economics, and then one on the greater history in Europe, so you still understand the wider picture at play whilst we tell the history of Scotland. Also, sorry if this episode was rather short, or short compared to our last episode's standards, but I wanted to give more of a general overview of the warfare and not kind of delve too much into the details, because you really could talk about this topic for days and it could be its own podcast arguably as well. Next time we'll begin the reign of Edgar, for real this time, son of Margaret and Malcolm, the first of his 3 brothers coming to the throne. His reign is going to be rather short, but sadly I will only be able to fill 1 episode with his reign, but don't worry. Episodes after that will be our 2-part Crusade special, where we go over the First Crusade and Scotland's participation in it. And then finally, after Edgar and the Crusade, we'll get to David I's reign. And let me tell you, as you probably know, with all the hints and all the stuff, I really can't wait to get to his episodes. And he will change all of Scotland for, if I'm honest, the better. I have 4 episodes planned for our King David I, so we can get back to more detail in his king's life. Thank you again to everyone for the continued support on this series. If you have the time, please also follow our Twitter at the History of SC1, or just search the History of Scotland. We also have a Facebook group called the History of Scotland, so if you wish to discuss the episodes with myself, with feedback and comments, please head there. As always, any corrections or issues with this podcast, please let me know at historyofscotlandpodcast@gmail.com. That is historyofscotlandpodcast@gmail.com. Quick update as well, the reviews have hit a 4.9 rating with 61 reviews on Spotify. We've got over 10 to 12 reviews on Apple Podcasts, and then our Facebook group is growing, our Twitter's growing followers. It's really cool to see so much support. So if you haven't, please leave any review you can on either platform, and also join our Twitter, follow our Twitter page, and join our group to discuss the episodes more in future. But as always, please leave a review on any other podcasting site you are on, and our podcast is always available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and many other great podcasting sites. Next podcast will not be next week, but the week after, as I am on my second holiday, as I mentioned. So until around the 5th of September, which is when I'm planning to return, stay safe, have a great couple of weeks until then, have a good one, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Have a good one, guys. See you later. Peace.